But if you are a non-affiliated voter in Florida, you can't vote in the Democratic or Republican primaries. Or let's say you're a Democrat, but really like that former Republican Congressman David Jolly, who you see all the time on TV taking on President Trump and congressional Republicans. You might well vote for that Republican despite the fact he calls himself a proud conservative, despite sometimes taking shots at Democrats. You might be tempted to vote for David Jolly because he doesn't always go with the flow. When it comes to his own party, he calls it the way he sees it. But David Jolly isn't on the ballot this year because he knows there is no way he can win a Republican primary, even though he might be able to win a general election with help of Democrats and independents. He is not on the ballot, but he's at the trapezoid, along with Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. David, did I get it pretty much right?
Yeah, that's great. You should be my spokesperson if I do run.
I'll tell you what my own personal position has always been. Tell me why I'm wrong. Is it too much to ask if you're the Republican Party or the Democratic Party that you have members of the party vote and not have independents or Republicans or Democrats, playing games in terms of trying to maneuver who is the nominee?
I'm glad you bring that up right out of the gate, because there's a case to be made for closed primaries. And in fact, the Supreme Court has supported that going back all the way to the 50s, I believe, in an NAACP case about the freedom of association and closed organizations. The state senator before the break said he would be worried about cross-voting. And that's true, although that would not often happen. The reality, though, is you have to make a political value judgment. And what we see in modern politics is that parties have insulated their own incumbents, and you have elected officials only listening to the voices within their party. And it's an all or nothing, winner take all in November, as opposed to creating a system that rewards members for reaching across the aisle. Oftentimes when we talk about accountability, it's about punishment. What I like to talk about is how can we create stronger candidates in both parties? A Republican that can hold their base but win independents and Democrats, a Democrat that can hold their base and win independents and Republicans.
Frank, isn't this a reflective of where we are in general? It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that we are becoming so much more partisan than we used to be, that whether you're on the left or on the right, it may be the candidates we nominate are only reflective of that.
We are becoming more polarized. There's lots of data out there. There are a number of reasons for that go beyond gerrymandering and non-competitive districts, have a lot to do with media consumption and the balkanization of information. But getting back to this issue, I think we're talking about who represents a political party in a competitive general election, I think the value of autonomy and allowing Republicans or Democrats to choose who represents their party in a competitive election, I understand that, but the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of political districts out there, especially if you get out of below statewide districts, they're not competitive. And so when we're talking about the probability of one political party's candidate winning, being 95 to 100%, then effectively that primary is not a primary. It's really an election of who's going to represent the entire district. And at that point, if you do not open it up to a broader range of voices, there are compromises that you're making on competition and accountability. And so there's a sacrifice of values that comes with keeping a closed system. And I think by opening it up, there's a lot to gain and not as much to lose.
David, when you were running the first time and even the second time, what kind of pressures were on you from the party in Washington to basically, stick to the script?
Oh, enormous. And in part, the three-legged stool is a gerrymandered district, closed primaries, and then campaign finance. And you need the money from the party, so you have to be good to your party. Your question about polarization, though, is interesting. We're seeing polarization because polarization is being rewarded at the ballot box because of these structural challenges. Alan, when I got elected, I had a moment that I like to think most members of Congress have. I hope they do, which was I realized I held the public trust. And though I had only been elected by about 2 points, largely all Republicans, I believed my job was to represent everybody. And so I woke up trying to think about how can I as a Republican represent Democrats? I struggled with that every day and I tried to honor that. But the reality is, for most members of Congress in a closed primary gerrymandered district, the only way to get reelected is not to represent your whole community. It's to represent the party that insulates you and funds your campaign. That's what we're trying to break up.
Frank, I remember a day where there were more moderate or conservative Democrats and more moderate Republicans. I mean, I grew up in New York where Jacob Javits was a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican. That doesn't seem to exist anymore.
No. Again, there are more than one reason for that, but it is a climate where people that truly feel like they're independent voices and combine a combination, say, of values that do represent a district, and it puts them in a position that is not adhering to the extreme wings of a political party. There's no safe space for them anymore, and part of the reason is, if we have closed primaries in non-competitive districts, it is a very a small amount of folks that have a lot of influence. And what Congressman Jolly said, that's a dilemma that representatives have to face. Who am I accountable to? If you have a sense that you're accountable to everybody that you represent, that's great, but you're not going to be around for very long. And that's why I think we have a lot of folks representing us that don't feel like they're accountable to their entire district, just a very select few that control the outcome of a primary.
But David, a critic might say, look, you could always primary the incumbent congressman. You could always, primary the party favorite. It happened a couple of years ago with the House Majority Leader who lost his bid for re-election.
Not with a moderate, though. You're always
You're
always going to primary them from the extreme wing.
That's exactly right. You cannot primary somebody from the middle because you don't have a constituency in the middle, because they are not prohibited to vote in a primary. The good news about this, though, Alan, is we are seeing changes to the primary system in states across the country. It's being talked about in Florida. California's adopted this top two, which is everybody gets to vote in the primary. The top two candidates move to November regardless of party affiliation. And we're seeing a bunch of different modifications. At the end of the day, and this really is important, we want all voters to have a voice, right? Your question at the beginning, shouldn't primaries be closed to only party members? If you ask the public that, about 60% say, yes, only party members should choose their party nominee. But if you say, should every voter have access to the ballot? That's a 90% response you get from voters.
Frank, again, if you are an independent voter, a non-party affiliated voter in Florida, you are basically shut out of the primary system, whether it's for a House race, Senate race, or even the presidential cycle.
That's right. And if you're an independent voter that doesn't happen to be in a competitive district, and competitive districts are few and far between in general elections, then you actually have no say whatsoever. You can't even walk in and influence the primary election unless you change your party affiliation.
And we're going to talk about, there are a number of different systems out there, but also, David, look, we just had the Constitutional Review Commission unanimously vote against putting this up for a vote.
Because incumbents don't want it, because it threatens their incumbency. This is all about protecting power in Tallahassee and Washington. Here's a way that we could split the baby, if you will, and have a system that I believe really works. Have closed primaries, that's fine. But then when the parties nominate a Republican or a Democrat, they go to November. But if I'm not the party's nominee, I should still have access to the ballot as well. And when you, Alan, receive your ballot, you would see the nominee of the Republican Party, the nominee of the Democratic Party, and all of these other registered Republican and Democratic candidates that you could choose from.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up. We'll have much more on open primaries right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about open primaries, and joining us for more are former Republican Congressman David Jolly and New College political science professor Frank Alcock. David, let's talk about, I'm interested how it's done in California, because as you said, anybody could run in the primary and the top two then face off each other in the general election. It could be two Republicans, it could be two Democrats, or whatever.
Yeah, and this is a newer experiment. One of the things with open primaries is we don't have a lot of conclusive data from any of these state experiments. The top two primary is something that intuitively people say, yeah, that does seem fair, right? If the top two candidates are chosen, they should go to November. The data out of California is a little obfuscated because it's such a deeply blue state. And so you're seeing a lot of Democrat versus Democrat opponents in November.
Frank, if the move to get this on the ballot in the Constitutional Revision Commission really did not go anywhere, where is the possibility of it getting to voters here in Florida?
A citizens initiative. I think you're going to have to, the citizens are going to have to take it. Yeah,
right.
I think if people understand what the initiative is, and there are multiple options, so you have to choose one. You can't put multiple options as a proposed constitutional amendment. But I think there'd be a lot of support for it. It's just something that both political parties and some of the minor parties are not in favor for it because they like to retain party control. But I think it's certainly something that, with enough sustained effort and some funding, you could get enough signatures for it to be put on the ballot.
Finally, David, until something is done to open up the primary system, where do Republicans like you go, who you're not a supporter of the president, you are not a Democrat, and you've told me before you're not going to switch over to being a Democrat.
Right.
Where do you go if you want to have an impact on what happens?
Yeah, that's a hard question for somebody in my position. It's hard for me to find a home in the Republican Party, but I would also say I can't find one in today's Democratic Party either. They're having their own family conversation. I think the time is right for some type of third party to emerge, but we know history has proven what an enormous challenge that is. And without maybe $500 million behind it from a benefactor, that's not practical. So today I choose to stay in the Republican Party, but some mornings I wake up and I'm just not quite sure if I'll still be there by nightfall.
Okay, we have to leave it there.